trust that God is going to bless us through his word. Well, last time we looked at the account of the raising of Dorcas to life. She'd been a fine Christian and served the Lord very well. She was full of good works. She'd cared for the poor. She'd made the widows of the church lovely coats and garments. But she caught a sickness, and later on she died of this sickness, and everybody was sad. However, Peter was nearby, and they sent for him. And he put the people out of the room where the body was, and he prayed. He prayed for the Lord's intervention. And then he turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, arise." And God powerfully raised her from the dead, and the church rejoiced greatly. Peter then stayed on living in Joppa. News of this event led to many people being saved in that city, and he lived with a man called Simon the tanner. Now, up until this time, the apostles had taken to the gospel only to the Jews. Saul had been saved, and he had been chosen to be the special prophet to the Gentiles, but as yet he wasn't active in that work, and he was still staying in his own hometown of Tarsus. As for Peter, he still felt that God was only interested in the Jews, and that the Gentiles are very much second-class citizens and not deserving of the gospel. And the Lord decided to show Peter how wrong he was, and at the same time save some precious souls. The opening verse of chapter 10 tells us of a certain man upon whom God decided to show mercy. His name was Cornelius. And the first thing we're told about him is that he was a soldier, a Roman centurion who commanded over 100 other soldiers, and he was responsible for guarding the city of Caesarea. Caesarea called after the Roman Emperor Augustus Caesar. Now, Caesarea was on the coast like Joppa was. Caesarea is 40 miles north of Joppa. They're both at the seaside. And ships used to travel frequently from there to Rome. And all the soldiers came from Rome, and they were called the Italian Band. And they were natives of Italy. And what's interesting, later on, when these people become Christians, they're given the gift of tongues. And that could well be to do with the fact that there's so many travellers coming and going to this town of Caesarea, particularly the Roman people. Cornelius was one of 3 very fine centurions who were saved in the New Testament. The others were the one who came to Christ asking that his servant might be healed. And he said he wasn't worthy to be under the same roof as the Lord. And the Lord said about him that he'd not found anybody with greater faith than him up until that point. And then there was the other centurion who was at the cross, who later stated, "Truly this man was a son of God." There was a 4th centurion called Julius, who may have become a Christian through Paul as he took him by ship to Rome later on in the Acts. Nothing is said about his salvation, but it does talk about how kind he was. Now, verse 2 tells us 5 very favourable things about Cornelius. First of all, he was a devout man. He was a Gentile soldier, yet a religious man and not an idolater. Many soldiers serving in foreign countries are immoral and licentious. Indeed, the Romans were infamous for this sort of conduct, but not Cornelius. He not only believed in God, he was devout, meaning that he was dedicated to God's worship and service. Secondly, he feared God. He not only believed in the true God, the maker of heaven and earth, but he feared to offend him. He was a God-fearing man. And when somebody's God-fearing, it means it puts a curb on their behaviour, because they're all the time thinking about what God would think. He's a great soldier. He doesn't tremble before any man, but he did before God. And then thirdly, his was a God-fearing family. It says all his house the same. No idolater was allowed to live under his roof. His wife and children revered God as well. Fourthly, he gave money and alms to the poor, especially to the poor Jews that were living around him. That was the same about the other centurion who lived in Capernaum. You remember, so one man's over Caesarea, the other man's over Capernaum. They're trying to help the poor people there. And then fifthly, it says he prayed to God always. He got alone with God every day and sought direction from him. And we see here that those who fear God will show this in acts of kindness and prayerfulness. We can also see here that soldiers have no excuse for not seeking the Lord and serving him when they're away from home. We have SASRA, don't we? The people who work amongst the military people, they tell us about some fine Christian soldiers. Whatever a person's employment is and whatever their situation is, if their heart belongs to God, then they will live the Christian life. Now verses 3 to 6 tell us of a vision which Cornelius had one day. It took place at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which is called here the 9th hour of the day. And in this vision he saw an angel coming to him with directions for him as to what to do. And if you look down to verse 30 for a moment, where Cornelius describes what was happening to him, you'll see that he'd been fasting and then prayed at the 9th hour. Possibly then it was an answer to these prayers that the angel came at that certain time. It's also interesting that Christ died at the 9th hour of the day after 3 hours of darkness. Possibly it was as if the prayer of Cornelius was being accepted at the 9th hour through the merits of Christ's death on the cross. Possibly an angel was sent because it was an important point in history, the beginning of the gospel going to the Gentiles. So an angel is sent there for that reason. And that word evidently there, it means that he saw the vision clearly. What he saw was evident. It wasn't a dream, it wasn't his imagination. And the angel called him by his name, showing that he was interested in him personally. Verse 4 tells us that Cornelius was frightened by the vision, as would most people be. Remember the 3 visits of the angel at Christmas. Came to the shepherds and they were frightened. Came to Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, he was frightened. Came to Mary and she was frightened. And of course that would be true about us all. He asked, "What is it, Lord?" He wants to know why he's being contacted like this. Had the Lord got some special message for him? And the angel told Cornelius that his prayers and his alms had come up as a memorial to God, meaning that the Lord had taken notice of what he'd been doing and had recorded them down in his book of remembrance, and indeed would now act on this. The Pharisees had prayed and given alms, but they'd done it to be seen of men. They wanted people to remember them. But Cornelius was altogether different. What he'd done in secret. So God would now reward him openly, as the Lord Jesus has said. The prayers he prayed in his closet had been listened to by God, and blessings would come as a result. And so it's been in every generation that those who pray secretly today will be rewarded openly tomorrow. And God has an account of those good works which are done by people with no thought of earthly gain. Now verses 5 and 6 tell us of the angel's instructions. Cornelius must send some of his men to Joppa and find a man called Simon Peter. He was staying with a certain man whose house was near the seaside. And this man, Simon Peter, will tell you what you ought to do, says the angel. Cornelius was given no option, you'll notice. This was something that he must do. You see, he was a devout man of prayer and good works, yet he was not yet a Christian. And he must become one. He hadn't even heard the gospel. He knew nothing about Jesus Christ. It is a sad fact, but there are many people today who are religious and pray and do good, and yet they're not yet Christians. And some of them have heard the gospel, but a few of them, like Cornelius, have never heard the gospel. It's even possible for a person to be part of an evangelical church and attend the meetings and pray and do good, yet not be a real Christian at all and be on their way to hell. All the prayers and charity of Cornelius couldn't save his soul. He needed Christ to save him, or he'd be lost. That's why I read to you that bit in chapter 11, where the angel says to the Cornelius, he shall tell thee of the words whereby thou and all thy house shall be saved. He needed to be saved like everybody else. You'll notice that the angel himself doesn't give Cornelius the gospel, but he sends him to Peter, because angels were not given the great privilege to preach the gospel, but Christian men and women are. However, it is the work of angels to be used by the Holy Spirit in bringing people under the sound of the gospel. We probably don't realise it, but there are invisible beings around us all the time, controlling what we do, keeping us from getting hurt, and bringing us into contact with people like here. Verses 7 and 8 tell us that as soon as the angel departed, Cornelius sent 2 of his servants and a soldier to Joppa. He wasted no time. He was obedient. He longed to know more about God and do whatever he had to do. Whenever the Lord points out anything in us regarding our soul's good, we should be quick to put it into practice. The devil sometimes whispers in the Christian's ear, yes, there is deficiency in your Christian life, but don't put it right now, leave it till later. Notice that the other soldier here, who's going to see Peter, is also called devout. So you had a devout centurion with a devout soldier. For godly people usually have an impact for good on those around them, and that's what happened with Cornelius. When there was a special job to be done, it was the devout man who was asked to do it. And so it usually is with the Christians capped in our Lord Jesus Christ. When Stephen's dead body needed to be buried, it was devout men that buried him. And we should ask ourselves the question at this point, do I see myself as a devout Christian? Am I in earnest about my Christian faith and my Christian life? There's devotion in every part of life, or an absence of it. You can get a husband and wife who are devoted to each other. But a lot of husbands and wives are not. You get men who go to a football match, and they're not just going there for the enjoyment of it. They're devout about it. They'll stand there in the rain, they'll travel miles to see their team play, and the result of the match would be seen as all important to them. They're devout about it, and that's not necessarily a good thing. Are Christians like that about their walk with God? Oh, that God would make all the people in our own church devout. Notice also that Cornelius tells his 3 men the purpose of their mission. It says he declared it to them. He told them about the angel's visit. He told them what they needed to do. And this was in order that they might realise the importance of what they were about and give them a greater determination to come back with Peter. But the question was, would Peter go with them? After all, he was a Jew, and the Jews had no dealings with the Gentiles, not even a good man like Cornelius. Even for a Jew to touch a Gentile would make them ceremonially unclean. So it was necessary for the Lord to work at both ends, just like he prepared Philip for the Ethiopian eunuch and Ananias for Saul, so he prepared Peter for Cornelius. And he also prepares Christians today for the people that they're going to meet. And sometimes God works in the hearts of two Christians who are at loggerheads with each other, dealing with them both and giving them both a desire to sort it out and be good friends again. And of course, when the Lord has planned for two people to get married, he also deals with them both and makes them ready for each other and leads them to spend their lives with each other. Christ had previously told the apostles, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." Not a question of race or nationality. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. But even the great apostle Peter, who'd been used to raise Dorcas from the dead, couldn't see the emphasis and purpose of Christ's words. We've often seen other great men in the Bible with big failings. We saw one last Sunday evening, didn't we? David telling lies. And here is this great man of God in the New Testament failing the Lord through racial prejudice. The more you study the Bible, Old and New Testament, the more you'll find what a shambles we all are. As the psalmist put it, man at his best estate is altogether vanity. Verse 9 tells us that as the men from Cornelius approached the city of Joppa after their long journey, Peter went up to the roof. He didn't go up to the roof to sunbathe, but to pray. And we're told that this was the 6th hour of the day, so that would be noontime to us. Oh, it must have been a very lovely spot, mustn't it? On top of a house near the seaside. It would have been hot, no doubt, at noon, but cool breezes would have been coming in from the sea. And Simon the tanner's house reminds us of many a holiday dwelling at the seaside, sort of place you might go for your holidays. And Peter's experience here shows us that prayer is essential in such places. For Peter, this housetop was the best place to pray. To start with, he could be on his own and away from other people, as Christians are advised to do. And then he could look up into the sky from that rooftop and remind himself that God was in the heavens, high and lifted up. He could also look out to sea and remind himself of the vastness of God's creation. And he could look down upon the city of Joppa and remind himself of people's needs. And that's probably what he was praying about. And it was in answer to this prayer that the men were coming for him. Notice then that Cornelius and Peter were both given guidance immediately after prayer, and that could happen with us. Verse 10 tells us that he became very hungry. Whether he deliberately fasted or more likely was simply just waiting for his midday meal is not clear, but God used his hunger to teach him that truth which he was going to get in this trance. It says that he would have eaten, meaning that he was longing for food, but he had to wait until the person in the house who prepared the food, probably Simon the tanner's wife, to make the lunch ready. This trance made him lost to the world, as if he was in a deep sleep and the world was completely shut out. He had such a concentration of mind that bodily senses seemed to have gone for a while. And verse 11 states that he saw heaven opened. And that would show him that the message was from heaven and it must be complied with. In this vision, a certain vessel was let down from heaven to earth, and it was made out of a sheet which had been sewn together at the four corners in order that the contents would not fall out. And that could be a picture of a Christian church which has its origin in heaven, but it's composed of all sorts of different people who are gathered into the church from the four corners of the earth. Those men and women truly in the church of Christ cannot fall out of it, for the corners of the church are knit together. Verse 12 makes it clear that within this sheet were all sorts of animals, some of which were unclean for the Jews to eat. But in verse 13, Peter is told to kill an animal and turn it into meat and eat what he wants of it in order to feed his hunger. Very strange, wasn't it? But he was being shown that there was no longer any separation between clean and unclean, between Jew and Gentile. But Peter replies in verse 14 that he wouldn't do that because he'd never eaten anything that was common or unclean. This was an obvious message to Peter regarding his racial prejudice. Just like he regarded certain meats as unclean, so he regarded certain people as unclean. He was somewhat prejudiced against all races apart from the Jewish race, and that was totally wrong. For God would save people from every race, every language, every colour, every nationality. There would seem to be, and this is a controversial thing to say, but there would seem to be an evil within the human heart that can make people dislike those of another race. And yet it should be obvious to everybody that nobody chose what race they are of. They never chose where they were born or what their colour is. To be against a person because of their race is like being against a person because of their size or their age or their gender. And it's always wrong to look down on somebody for something over which they've got no control. And this problem is still very much with us today. There's a lot of racial tension, a lot of trouble about it. But God would have us Christians to love all men and women, whatever their race. But notice there's two words at the end of verse 14, not just unclean, but the word common. You see, not only do some people have a prejudice against those of another race, but also against those of a lower class or a poorer background. We've all heard people speaking about those people are common people. So you've not only got people who've got disadvantages in life, but on top of that, they can be looked down because they've got disadvantages in life. May God deliver Christians from looking down on men and women and boys and girls who are deprived. What's the worst thing of all in this business? What's the worst thing of all? It's when a Christian looks down on another Christian because of their race. Now, it's got to be terrible, that, isn't it? Perish the thought. There have even been cases where a Christian's children are told not to mix with the children of another Christian because they're of a different race or a different background. What does God say to such people? Well, what did he say to Peter in verse 15? What God has cleansed, that call not thou common. How dare we say that people are common? And especially how wrong it would be to say that about those whom God has cleansed through the precious blood of his Son. They're far from being common. And God has put his seal on the person. They are the apple of his eye. They are priests and kings. They are his children. And Christ is not ashamed to call them his brethren. So how could anybody call them common? And Peter had to learn about this so that he could meet with Cornelius and the Gentiles. Now you'll notice that verse 16 tells us that Peter was shown this truth 3 times. That's very important. His racial prejudice was so deeply ingrained that the message had to be repeated to impress the importance upon him. But there's more in it than that. Why 3 times? Well, remember what had happened to Peter previously. He denied the Lord, you remember, in front of those people 3 times. And the Lord had said to him 3 times, you've got to feed my sheep. And I wonder if in this situation here, whether that business of the past came back to his mind. Who was Peter to call others unclean? He had deserved nothing. He was shown grace, and he must show that to others. If ever a Christian looks down on somebody else, especially for something which the person is not responsible for, they have forgotten what they used to be. Before we were Christians, we were like unclean lepers. What did Isaiah say when he had a clear vision of the Lord? I am a man of unclean lips. Let's just stick to me for a moment. He saw his own failings. And so here in the Acts of the Apostles, the vessel was received up again into heaven. And we shall see next time, God willing, what Peter's response was to all this and whether he learned the lesson. But one last thing of interest is the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament here. For Joppa was the place where Jonah was. And what was it that Jonah was called to do? He was called to go to the Gentiles, and he didn't want to do that. He thought that God was only interested in the Jews. And he actually believed that the people of Nineveh would be saved, and he didn't want to go there. He was so prejudiced. Now here, in the very same place in the New Testament, Peter is called upon to go to the Gentiles, and his prejudice has to be dealt with. So it's gone on through all history, hasn't it? Jonah's day, Peter's day, our day, it's always there. We are Gentiles. How thankful we are that the gospel came to us and that we were saved by grace. May God take away any prejudice that we may have and love all Christians, and to him be all the glory. Amen. Amen.